So I have so many things that are floating around in my head that I feel like I could make into videos if I was able to focus in on them. But I think that first, what I want to get out of the way here, even though it feels like a delay to really diving into some of those topics, is introducing myself a little bit, my background, my political history and background, because in no way do I ever want to be disingenuous or dishonest. And I don't think I've ever done that on this channel or any other channel. But I think that it could feel that way to someone who watches me talk about certain topics and kind of assumes my political background. And I mean, that's on you, of course, for assuming. Nobody should ever assume anything. And if you want to know something, just ask. That's true of anybody and anything. But I want to go ahead and put some things out here. I don't have this plan to rehearse, so I'll just jump in. Um, I was raised in a household that was a little bit unique in that it was politically liberal and socially conservative. I feel like it's a lot more common, and it used to be kind of a common phrase to say that somebody was politically conservative and socially liberal, meaning that they like, sorry, I'm gonna get my liberal background is showing here, but meaning that they like to regulate how other people behave, but they don't like to regulate how they behave in their own household. And I'm sure someone could put that in a much more positive light, who actually identifies with that, and would maybe say, well, I like conservative fiscal policies and conservative political policies in this way or that way, but you know, I'm I'm socially liberal. I like to drink. I like to do, whatever that you call socially liberal. My family was kind of the opposite. And that's actually very kind of interesting. I don't hear of a lot of people who um, have that or grew up with that. And so what that looked like was that my parents, especially my dad, was fairly outspoken about liberal mindsets and political values. Um, and by that, I mean kind of the stereotypical ones, which are being challenged a lot now. And they should be challenged. We should always challenge um, the things that politicians, especially at the highest levels, feed us and try to identify with, because half the time, if not more than half the time, it really is a false flag. It really is them saying, hey, I want to get the vote of everybody who says that they, care about all people equally, and that they value equality, which is a very basic thing. I mean, it's right in the Constitution, right? It's in the statements made by the founding fathers, who did not act out that value all the time in their personal lives. Um, but so, the Liberal Party likes to say they're the party of equality. They're the party that is anti-racism. They're the party that is pro supporting all people with diverse backgrounds, abilities, beliefs, whatever. And sometimes both parties can be hypocritical in the and dishonest. Let's just face it, dishonest. Um, but at the time that I was growing up, it was kind of understood that if you were strongly anti-racist and pro-equality, then you were more likely to identify with the Liberal Party. And if you were anti-war, um, you were more likely to be liberal. And that's been challenged and changed a little bit lately too, with some like pretty heavyweight conservative thinkers and speakers and politicians and people coming out against funding endless wars in the Middle East or anywhere. And if anything, we've also seen how some liberal Democratic leaders, including Biden, were a little more, a little bit more willing to at least financially support wars such as the one in between Russia and Ukraine. I have become more willing to see an argument for both sides for certain things, whereas when I was like in high school, early college, it was no war ever for any reason. We can always solve problems without it. And we certainly shouldn't be the ones initiating a war. So, but socially, my family was very conservative, like one of the most conservative um, households that I knew of growing up, um, at least among the people that I hung out with, many of whom, because of where I grew up, were conservative and Republican politically. We did not drink. It was definitely not the place to go to have an underage drinking party, um, of which I only went to one when I was in high school, just kind of because it took that long for my friends to, or, for the popular kids who were all conservative, almost all conservative in my hometown. And that's just, it, you know, that's just a matter of where you grow up. It's not like only conservative kids drink in high school. It's just like pretty much the popular kids drink in high school. And in my particular hometown, the popular kids happen to be conservative because that was the mainstream. Um, that that was the that was what was mainstream, and it's always mainstream that is popular for the most part. And so, in a different city or place, I'm sure that the main crowd that was drinking underage was liberal, just because they were the popular kids, just because it was popular to be liberal in that town. So I think a lot of these, you know, moral high ground ideas that we have, pretty much circumstantial, right? You pretty much just do and think what the people around you do and think, at least when you're younger. And a lot of people, as they get older too, never really outgrow that or question it. And if you are outside of that norm, you either end up getting roped in or you develop some pretty strong reasons for why you're outside of it, because it's easier to go with the flow. Whether that flow is conservative, whether it's liberal, whether it's something else, whatever it is, it's easier to go with the flow. So people tend to either let go of those beliefs that they hold in order to fit in with the majority and fit in with who's popular, or they really start to know and understand, think about why they believe what they believe and whether they really want to still believe it, despite the fact that it's a little bit harder. And in my case, for the most part, I came to some pretty strong conclusions about why I held the beliefs that I held. I thought that, for example, with war, um, I've always held the opinion that in a war like World War II, and maybe this is because I don't know enough about World War II, but I know a couple things that are pretty darn sure. Um, and one is that Germany invaded Poland, and I believe that was the first country that they invaded. And then they invaded other countries. And Japan, after allying with Germany, bombed the US at Pearl Harbor. So it's really hard, when people are saying currently, well, I think we need to have a better understanding of what Germany and Hitler's beliefs really were, and maybe he wasn't all that bad of a guy. Okay, maybe we should have an understanding of what the beliefs were and what the actions were besides the really obvious ones that we know about, but those things still happened. And it's really kind of hard to defend an individual or a country or an alliance that directly attacked us without being provoked, just for no reason other than like world dominance and a war of aggression on their part. So there's that. So I've always felt, World War II was a little bit different because we were responding to a threat. And it wasn't like, I kind of think that these guys might have some weapons type of threat. It was like they bombed us and then we annihilated them, as we should have. And we didn't do that alone. The U.S. was a massive deciding factor in the outcome of that war. We were a superpower, like we were a force to be reckoned with. And I'm proud to come from the country where that happened. I wasn't involved with it directly. I can't take credit for it. 3 of my 4 grandparents were in that war. Um, my grandpa on my dad's side was a CB. Grandma on my dad's side was an Army nurse. And grandpa on my mom's side was in the Navy. All of them saw action in that war. Um, that hits differently than a war where we're like, I think they're probably developing some weapons. It's not conclusive, but let's just bomb the hell out of this country and kill tens of thousands of innocent civilians. And that's what I was against in high school. And apparently that made me liberal, because if you supported President Bush at the time, who was a Republican, you supported the war. And I never thought that that was necessary. Why couldn't you be a Republican who didn't like killing tens of thousands of innocent people over a purported threat that hasn't even been proven and was basically shown to not be a threat, and over a misrepresentation of the reality of 9/11. Even if you don't get into the conspiracy stuff, even if you pretty much take that event at face value, what was known about it didn't have anything to do with Iraq. If it did, it was like a fringe connection. It was definitely not initiated by Iraq. And that war was kind of sold to us as a response to 9/11. It wasn't a very good response to it. It didn't address the main problems or our main enemies who actually attacked us. And then we had this separate war in Afghanistan, but it was all sold as kind of a package deal. But it wasn't a package deal. Going after those who directly attacked the U.S., I think, was legitimate. But destabilizing the entire Middle East through the attack in Iraq was not legitimate. And I, as someone who had a liberal background, as most people do, you focus on what makes your point better. So I didn't really focus much on the war in Afghanistan, and I still don't understand much about that one because I didn't look into it, and probably I didn't look into it because intuitively I knew that it wasn't going to align as well with my anti-war, pro-peace ideology. Because if I looked into that one, I might have come to the conclusion that this is kind of justified. And maybe there'd still be criticisms, probably would still be criticisms about, like, how are we doing it? How are we going about this? Are we being as effective as possible? Are we meeting, the main security and national interest goals of the United States? Or are we, like, killing a bunch of people that we don't need to kill? Valid questions. I don't know the answers to them. I never really looked into that war that much. But the war in Iraq and the Patriot Act, I looked into because something intuitively told me this is as it should have, as anybody should have intuitively felt if you're kind of stepping away from the whole situation. This is a war we shouldn't be in. And one of my first major political acts, I guess, and something that I haven't had the willingness to do since then, because it was a lot of work. I was like, okay, this Patriot Act sounds really suspicious. I'll give you a couple reasons it sounds suspicious. It sounds suspicious because it was pushed through in an incredibly short time after 9/11, but it was sold to us as the American people as a response to 9/11. This is something we have to do to protect ourselves from what happening again. And I was like, you wrote 1,000 pages in like 12 days and said it was all in response to this event? That sounds crazy suspicious. And then when I actually read it, it got even more suspicious because every single line in that act is like, Article 12, subsection B of document 22A7 is amended as follows by replacing the words shall not infringe upon with when necessary. Like, it referenced thousands of other documents that were obviously themselves massive documents and made adjustments and changes. It's like, how would you ever, first of all, how did the politicians who voted to push through that act, how did they actually make an informed vote? There's no way. The only informed vote would be a no vote or a give us more time vote. Because as soon as you look at it, you are informed of the fact that it's going to take you hundreds of days of literally looking at it for hours a day and cross-referencing all this stuff to understand what it's actually doing. So to vote yes on that act soon after the fact of it being introduced is to just blindly believe what the politicians are telling you, that this act is in the interest of our public safety. Right? You either believe that or you say, I'm going to withhold judgment. Not even say, no, it's not. Not even make any assumption at all. Just say, let me check that for myself. And then you realize it's going to take you a long time to check it for yourself. But maybe you don't need to check the whole thing, because if you go through the first page and you go check all those cross-references and you're like, that doesn't really sound like something that's necessary for our national security, or even if it is, we're trading our security, or we're trading our freedom for security, right? And isn't that a big conservative thing, that we don't trade our freedom for security or a sense of security? Our freedom is so important that we will allow certain risks, but also at the same time, you bomb Pearl Harbor, we're going to wipe out your country, right? That's kind of the message that the U.S. sent a long time ago. And that's kind of why we don't have to go fight these preemptive wars. We don't have to go attack anybody to kind of beat them to the punch. It's like, yeah, we're that tough guy. We'll let you hit us first. But when you take that first punch, get ready to be sent to the hospital, right? You're not going to get a second punch in, and you're going to be on an IV. So to me, that's the classic good guy story, right? And I'm a little bit more of a pacifist. I still believe in some of those liberal, roots. And I'm a little bit more of a pacifist who's like, okay, I want to, I want to have that fantasy where I'm not going to punch somebody, but, I get into some situation, the other person's obviously wrong. I probably should punch them, but I don't. And then they swing on me and I put them in the hospital, right? Most men have that fantasy. Maybe some women do too. But when I really think about it, I'm like, no, it's probably not how I want to live. But I couldn't be mad at somebody for doing it. I wouldn't even be mad at myself if it happened. I might be a little bit like, if I actually hurt somebody. But, most people, liberal, conservative, other, aren't going to get mad at that. And that's, that's the position that America put themselves in, going back to at least the 40s, at least World War II. And for some reason, that's why that war is so impeccable. It has such an impeccable reputation. The U.S. has such an impeccable reputation. I'm sure individuals did bad things. Individuals will always do bad things to some limited extent. But by and large, in the American imagination and reality, we are heroes of that war. And it's because we waited till Somebody hit us first, and then we finished it. And that's the way it should be. That's how a strong person conducts themselves, and that's how a strong nation conducts itself. And so this war in Iraq didn't work for me. And this spying, this ability to spy on anybody as granted by the Patriot Act, didn't sit well with me. And it shouldn't have sat well with conservatives or liberals or anybody. Because even if we assume the very best about the government, they're only going to use that ability to spy on people for only the best purposes, which is a pretty unreasonable assumption. But even if we assume that, we are still trading a lot of liberty for the sense of security, and it's not even guaranteed to be security, because if the government misuses that ability, then it makes us less safe instead of more safe. And it could happen to you. I mean, it's written right into the act. It could happen to you. It can happen to anybody. Government's allowed to spy on all of us. Not that they need to anymore. We're all just, typing our opinions on Facebook anyway. But and on principle, that's not okay. Never should have been okay, especially under a conservative leadership. And here's the thing, even if it catches somebody before something happens, look, we can take care of ourselves. And that's a hard one, because you don't want to see anything bad happen to any innocent person ever. I think there's more effective ways to prevent it than spying on people. And that goes a little bit towards my liberal background and mindset and way of thinking. Try to understand people. Try to understand what motivates them. Try to resolve issues before they happen. Kindness goes a long ways. All that stuff. But also, if somebody's really intent on harming others, often there are signs. Not every single time, but often there are signs. And that's where, getting more towards the present, there are conservative mindsets and values that I'm really starting to value myself. One of which being criminals don't get a second chance. And it should depend a little bit on the crime. Speeding, things that weren't ever intended to harm somebody, I think people should get second chances for those, and third chances. Intending to harm somebody or actually harming somebody, you shouldn't get that second chance, because it's not worth the risk to innocent people. Rehabilitation is still a good thing. Correction rather than punishment are good things, I think. But they need to be effective. We need to actually get dangerous people out of positions where they can harm others. And it can be tricky, because there still should be an element of freedom and of innocent until proven guilty. And you should have the right to say what you want, to have free speech, to criticize others, criticize viewpoints, criticize even things that I think are ugly ways to use free speech, to criticize a group of people, an ethnicity, a race, a class of people, any category of people, to really say bad things about other people, and especially categories of people rather than individuals who might individually deserve it. Those are not things I get behind or believe in doing. However, freedom of speech is important. It's always been important to me. And this is where I like to think that I've been a little bit of a free thinker, even when I identified more with a political party, which I don't identify with either now, to get to that point. But certain values are obviously important enough that it shouldn't matter what side of the political spectrum you're on. They're kind of non-negotiable. To me, freedom of speech is freedom of speech. It applies to everybody across the board equally, whether you're using it to say good things or bad things, nice things or mean things, that's what freedom means. It's that it's not limited, um, that there's no right or wrong way to use it. There's good or bad ways to use it, but ultimately at the end of the day, it's freedom. Freedom means you can use it for good or bad. Doesn't mean you should, but it's protected. And I think a big part of the reason that it's protected is because if it's not protected, if you're not allowed to say bad things, then who gets to decide what's bad? Whoever's in power, of course, is going to decide what's good and what's bad. And that creates a bigger problem than just allowing everyone to have free speech. And we hope that people are intelligent enough to, for the most part, sort it out. And, when you try to repress people from saying things, even if they have something really ugly to say, well, if you don't let them say it, then nobody can respond to it. And so that ugly thing starts to sound more and more true just because people don't have any practice responding to it. And then so when it does bubble up to the surface again and it gets heard, it sounds really attractive because no one has a response. No one knows how to refute it because we haven't had to for such a long time. We just said, nope, that's bad, that's bad, that's bad, don't say that, that's bad, that's bad. And people have kind of, gotten shoved or bullied into not saying it ever. And then when they finally decide, oh no, we're just gonna go ahead and say it, no one knows how to respond. And probably there is a really good, legitimate response to that. There's actually a way to completely disprove that ugly thing that somebody's saying. But if we haven't had to do that for a really long time, we kind of forgot what the reason is in the first place that we don't like that. We just label it racist or label it anti-Semitic is a big one. Now, we label it whatever, but there needs to be a reason. And often there is a reason. There is an intelligent, defensible, well thought out, well argued reason that statement is wrong or inaccurate or false or lacking context or whatever. But I don't think that we should ever rely on, no, you're just not allowed to say that. There has to be a reason, and we need to be ready to explain that reason every single time, even if it gets annoying or tedious. Because if we don't put out the counter argument, people are going to hear that, and they're not going to hear a counter argument, and they're like, wait a minute, maybe that's right. Which is, it's valid asking the question. It's not valid to keep asking the question over and over and over again after you've had a good response just to be annoying, to be an a-hole, to irritate people. You're allowed to, you have freedom of speech, you can use it that way if you want. However, I still don't find it to be valid. But, every once in a while, we do, even in our own lives, we need to be reminded, that one thing that I don't do, why don't I do that? Is there actually anything wrong with it? And then sometimes you're reminded, oh yeah, this is what's wrong with that. And every once in a while, you ask the question, you're like, yeah, I think that was just something that, like, when I was younger, I cared a lot about, and I don't anymore. Because I can't actually find a legitimate reason based on what I know now to think that thing is bad. And it's valid to ask those questions at intervals because that's how we grow. And hopefully evolve to be better and better, not worse and worse. But either way. And I think it's really important to face those questions, to face those statements head on and give real responses to them once or twice. Not over and over and over again because that person just is determined to believe something even when you've, explained a million times in a million different ways why it's not logical. A lot more recently. Went on a bunch of tangents here, but that's kind of what I intended to do. Um, because when I think about, things that I want to say or post, it's often very much just rabbit trail after rabbit trail. But I think that there's, things worth saying in there. And I just never know which of them I'm actually going to say when I talk to somebody or make a video like this. But I did start off with what's my history, what's my journey politically. For a long time, I was very non-political. Um, and that came with a lot of personal uncertainty. Just like, and also the changes that happened within the Liberal Party, Democratic Party, over time, to where I felt like what this party seems to stand for now isn't really what I felt strongly about back when I was more political. Like, it doesn't really seem to be a party that is opposed to war and violence and racism and a bunch of other things that I actually think are really valid. Seems like it's a party that's more like pro um, pro just not caring about um, anything really. Like, as long as I get to do whatever I want to do, who cares? And I don't really identify with that. I think that um, having stronger values than, like, as long as I get to dye my hair purple and change my gender if I want to. Um, I think that there's not that you shouldn't be allowed to do those things if you want to. I definitely don't think it should be on the government's dime, by which was the government's dime is really other people's dimes. The government doesn't have its own independent funds for the most part. I don't think that it should pay for that stuff, but if you want to do what you want to do in your own life, go for it. However, to kind of have the whole identity of a party start to feel more based around that than around a lot of really important world issues and national issues and societal issues. Um, it just was like, I don't feel like I identify with this anymore. Um, and it's not that I hate anybody or anything that does identify with it, but this is just like, um, feels like our society has had this major shift towards something that's not really that beneficial to society as a whole. And it does feel like, unfortunately, the mainstream liberal party or liberal social movement has moved away from wanting to follow a logical train of thought on any issue. And I'm not saying there aren't some really good liberal intellectual thinkers who have very solid, logically defensible arguments for whatever it is that they're focusing on. And for the most part, they're not focusing on these like surface social issues, but on like really hard-hitting, major, issues that have an impact on all of society and the world, and like life or death stuff. Not like, can I dye my hair stuff, like actual life or death stuff that really matters a lot. And I'm not saying that getting to express yourself the way that you want to doesn't matter a lot, because that's part of freedom. That is that is, like I said, just because I don't identify or agree with a certain way of speaking that's protected by freedom of speech, I still believe that freedom of speech is extremely important. Just because I don't agree or identify with the particular way that somebody is choosing to express themselves as an individual through how they look, how they present themselves, how they identify, it doesn't mean that isn't important that they have those freedoms in the United States because we're a free country. But I've found the Conservative Party to be somewhat interesting lately because of a lot of things that are happening, and I feel like I need to wrap this video up. It started with Charlie Kirk's death. I started looking and listening in on some of his stuff, and some of it I found kind of reprehensible. I'm gonna be honest. There's a lot of people who say, like, Charlie Kirk never said a single racist thing in his entire life. Bullshit. Within like the first several things that I listened to, which were randomly selected, not me like, cherry picking what, people who detract from him want me to listen to, but just listening to a few things, it's like, unfortunately, I think that his viewpoints sometimes went beyond, this logically defensible, I don't like affirmative action, and they sometimes crossed the line into, I don't want a black person to be my pilot. Because you kind of have to break down that, because you could say, well, yeah, because of affirmative action. Well, affirmative action is not the reason that every single black pilot got their pilot's license. It is possible that affirmative action played a small part in that journey that they took to becoming a pilot. But affirmative action was never going to take somebody who was wholly incompetent and unqualified and raise them into a position that they could not safely do. It may have bumped them a few small notches ahead of somebody else who was very slightly more qualified according to certain standardized tests, which don't effectively measure a person's ability in the first place, or according to grades at the high school level, which are not a perfect indicator of a person's aptitude, intelligence, or ability. So affirmative action was not taking, completely unqualified, incapable people and making them, able to enter into these roles. And what really makes it more of a racist type of statement, even than that, is the fact that every single person who has become a pilot could potentially have benefited from some sort of unfair circumstance in their life, whether it was a rich parent or uncle, or somebody who had connections with, a flight school, or, money talks in a lot of different ways and gets people into spots that they weren't the most qualified to be in. All of those and more could be reasons that a white person, or a person of any background, but statistically more likely a white person, got into the position of being a pilot. So the point is that any person of any color who is your pilot could have been benefited by something other than their intelligence and ability and got them into that role. But if you care more and you talk more and you talk a lot louder and more aggressively about people who happen to be black, who may or may not have benefited from a system that gave them a small assist in getting into that position, for me, that, among many other things, made me say there's an element of racism here, and it's not intentional. I don't think it's not malicious, but it's there, and I'm not going to ignore it or say it's not there. At the same time,